in the year 2007, I remember that I wrote an article in The Nation about Ajahn Montri Umavichani, arguably Thailand's greatest modern poet. At that time, I wrote that Montri wrote his poetry mostly in English, but with a distinctly Thai voice and Buddhist spirit. And his Thai poetry was equally excellent. Ajahn Montri had a passion for travel and truth and attempted throughout his life to fathom the innermost levels of human consciousness and experience. And now I'm with John Salt, who is a longtime friend of Ajahn Montri, and he's now an independent scholar. He's been knowing Ajahn Montri for several years. What should be the theme in the exhibition? I mean, when the public comes to this exhibition, what should they grasp, or learn immediately, about his work?
Okay, the main thing about Ajahn Montri was that his poetry was a journey, and the poem was a journey was the poem. And through his Buddhist consciousness, he tried to explain his quest for enlightenment, which went on for over 2,000 poems over 50 years. And each book is an integral inner journey in which he takes the challenge to try to find some spiritual depth in the world. And the results are amazing. Many Americans and other foreigners, Westerners who have read his poetry in English say they've never come upon anything like this, because it's a very Buddhist viewpoint, and it's not just poetry as experience, but it's poetry as experience for the quest of enlightenment. And very few people gamble with their lives to that extent except monks, and he wasn't a monk.
Isn't it a paradox or an irony? Because you mentioned earlier that as a Thai, but he wrote his poetry in English, and then he's more well-known in the international scene more than in the Thailand, poetic scene.
Yes, it's definitely ironic, and he did, of course, write poems in Thai also, and he also translated Chekhov and Conrad and some other great Western writers, Emily Dickinson, into Thai. So he definitely, as you mentioned in your article, has a sensitivity to the Thai language, which is also profound, but I can't speak for that. However, why did he choose to write in English is a bit of a mystery. If he had wanted his own poems in Thai, he may have translated them, but I think he felt less constrained by the English language in some ways. There have also been Japanese poets who sometimes prefer to write in English. And I don't think it was so much a rejection of Thailand as it was to internationalize Thailand in his own way, and that English was the best vehicle to do so. I thought for the exhibit that we would have one room with all of his poems pasted on the walls like wallpaper, and then people could have a ladder or two to climb the wall to read some of the poems, as well as having poetry readings. And I just want people to be introduced to the greatness of his work. There's some masterpieces which I think really deserve consideration. And as you know, Kuntanong, before World War II, poetry was the main art. It was the fountain from which all the arts flowed. And Picasso wrote
What went
poetry.
wrong after that?
What went wrong? Poetry became debased little by little. Through the 60s and 70s, a lot of experiments.
By the arrival of radios and televisions.
Yeah, that also, the conservative voices squelched the experimentation of the 70s when Ronald Reagan in the 80s and that new kind of right-wing thing came about, and that had a big effect on literature. Now Amazon.com has squashed a lot of small publishers, and so it's very hard now to think of poetry in the way that people did 50 or 100 years ago. In fact, I used to tell people that I'm a poet, but now I don't, because they just laugh when I say it. So. But what some people are realizing is that poetry is a central art, and it is a valuable art. For example, the Getty Museum, who will be doing a Yamamoto Kansuke's photo exhibit next year, they want to do an event around his poetry. And the Japan Society of Boston a few years ago also said, we haven't done a poetry event in a few years. So people understand that poetry is important. They just sometimes are at a loss on how to bring it into the art world, and the world is so visual these days.
But there are rare exhibitions on poetry nowadays? Because when we talk about exhibitions, it's mostly visual arts.
Yes, of course, in many countries like Japan, they have what are called literary museums, which are libraries holding the papers, the manuscripts, and the works of famous writers. And there they continually have exhibits of their manuscripts, their handwriting, their pens and glasses and artifacts. And so these kinds of exhibits do go on, and they're usually from the holdings of the specific libraries, but they deal with authors and poets and novelists. I just feel that we have here a living or a national treasure of Thailand from the 20th century. A poet of Montre stature comes, I think, once in a generation or once in 100 years. And so to lose it is like losing something that's too great. And so even though I feel very humbled to be saying this to Thai people, I want them to be aware of his work.
Is it possible to have the exhibitions not only, at the Bangkok Arts, Center, but also at one of the academic institutions?
That would also be wonderful. I would like to see many things done simultaneously. That is a new trend now where the museums come together to do things at the same time. Even though it's off the subject, there's now the largest exhibit in the history of the world going on in California called Pacific Standard Time. One can see it pst.org. There are over 100 institutions simultaneously showing California art from 1945 until 1980 or so. And each are doing it in a different way. So the idea is no longer to show oneself off as being different from the other, but to collaborate with the other and make something greater. And I think this trend in the arts could also be done here.